Watching professional sports is no longer limited to spectating, as fans have turned themselves into daily investors, earning income by playing without breaking a sweat.
As I've been more successful, your bankroll grows, you can afford to go up to those type of levels. But it's definitely a growth pattern where some people try to jump in and put their life savings in daily fantasy, and things don't go well.
Fantasy sports are legal. Online gambling is not. With the blossoming of online sites, has the line between the two become blurred?
Just because it's legal doesn't mean that it's right, and it doesn't mean that it's good social and economic policy. Fantasy sports and sports gambling in particular has got a target on it. It's got a target on it from Congress. It's got a target on it from the legal community.
The brewing controversy of daily fantasy sites and the federal government's watchful eye over the direction of this cottage industry. Today, Outside the Lines.
And now, sitting in for Bob Lee, Andy Katz.
An estimated 41 million people are playing fantasy sports in the United States and Canada, according to the Fantasy Sports Trade Association, and roughly 500,000 are playing daily fantasy. But in the last 3 years, the game is thriving, feeding an American culture obsessed with sports. Fantasy owners are getting their fix now, not just weekly during the football or baseball season, but daily, all year round, and in some cases, making it more than a side gig, but lucrative enough to call it their primary source of income. But the issue now is whether or not this is a legal venture, crossing over from simply a game of fantasy sports into all-out online gambling. ESPN's Darren Ravel reports.
During the weekday morning hours, Chris Prince is delivering mail in Ypsilanti, Michigan for the U.S. Postal Service. Come late afternoon, he's a respected voice in the fantasy sports world.
What's going on, grinders? Welcome back in. Chris Beermakers fan Prince here with the Daily Fantasy Six-Pack.
As 1,500 players tune into his daily webcast on a site called Roto Grinders.
There's not a ton of options at shortstop tonight.
What has made Prince a legend in this space is his winnings at daily fantasy games, an alternative to season-long fantasy where teams are picked daily and prizes are awarded at the end of the night.
How good are you at fantasy?
I think I'm very good. I would put myself up against most, if not anybody in the industry.
Prince says he doesn't know his net earnings, but says he's made a profit in each of his 5 seasons. In some years, he has made more from fantasy than from the post office, and he used that extra money towards his new house.
So when you went to your accountant and you saw the line item of fantasy winnings, what did he say?
It was, how do we classify this? We don't know where it goes. Is this income? Is it this, that? Now I have an accountant that knows how to handle it.
Each day, Prince logs into FanDuel, one of the daily fantasy market leaders, and sets multiple lineups using the site's salary cap system based on players' daily success.
How much are you throwing in here?
This will be a $50 head-to-head game.
And how much can you...
On a given day in the baseball season, he says he usually has about $1,000 on the line. Since football has fewer games, he might have $5,000 on the line in any given NFL week.
As I've been more successful, your bankroll grows, you can afford to go up to those type of levels. But it's definitely a growth pattern where some people try to jump in and put their life savings in daily fantasy, and things don't go well.
All right, I'm not asking you to give up the secret, but what is one factor that people would say, what? You look at that?
I think weather in baseball is the biggest one. And
really?
you learn the hard way when you have a couple players from a game, it rains, and you take a 0 from those players. I've learned to read a Doppler radar, believe it or not, which I never thought would come into fantasy sports.
In December 2011, Prince qualified for and won $75,000 at a FanDuel Championship football tournament in Las Vegas based on just a week of NFL games.
Wow, I wish you could be here.
His father accepted the prize for him while Prince stayed home for the birth of his 3rd child.
winning this it's such a good feeling. So thank you to FanDuel.
FanDuel awarded the prize and boasts of Prince's winnings of more than $650,000 on its website and through its marketing. Prince is also paid to endorse the company.
We use him in our marketing. He's very public about how much he's won, but there are a number of players at that level. Chris is just one of them.
Tom Griffiths is FanDuel's chief product officer and a co-founder.
The biggest sites get bigger because we're offering the biggest prizes. We can attract more players and therefore offer bigger prizes. So there's a network effect or a virtuous circle upwards.
FanDuel does not disclose how many players are ultimately winners over time. Come on! But the site, which has received $18 million in venture capital funding, recently disclosed its most current financial history, including revenue taken in from entry fees and money distributed in prizes. This chart shows the explosive growth of daily fantasy leagues in recent years. In 2011, the company took in more than $11 million and gave out more than $10 million in prizes. This year, the company took in close to $32 million in April alone, and estimates it will take in roughly $450 million in entry fees by year's end, while awarding 91% of that back to the players. According to the Fantasy Sports Trade Association, even though just 1% of fantasy sports players play daily, they account for 26% of all money played in the entire fantasy sports industry.
It's growing 2 to 3 times every year, bigger than the last year. Every week, it seems, there's a new daily fantasy competitor popping up. We stopped counting around 45.
Here at FanDuel headquarters in New York, employees monitor daily games on computer screens until baseball lineups have to be locked at 7 p.m. Eastern. Daily fantasy sites are required to disclose the prize pool in each game before the entries are made, but there's no other governmental monitoring or traditional gaming taxes. So how exactly is daily fantasy legal when gambling online is illegal? In 2006, the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act clarified online gambling regulations. The law says any participation in a fantasy or simulation sports game is exempted on the grounds that it has an outcome that reflects the relative knowledge of the participants, deeming it a game of skill.
Just because it's legal doesn't mean that it's right, and it doesn't mean that it's good social and economic policy.
Gambling expert John Kint says he believes daily fantasy is more a game of luck and that the fantasy sports loophole in the 2006 law shouldn't exist.
It was not the intent of Congress to allow these daily fantasy games and to cross the threshold into gambling. When you marry electronic gambling, which is known as the crack cocaine of hooking people into gambling with sports, with the risk-taking ambiance of young people, you're going to see a huge explosion in these types of endeavors.
45 states currently allow its residents to play fantasy sports for money, and none of those states has taken any action against daily games. But Kint says he believes the tide will soon turn as the scope of the new business has been realized.
Fantasy sports has got a target on it. It's got a target on it from Congress. It's got a target on it from the legal community.
FanDuel executives acknowledge that its typical players are in their mid-20s and likely more drawn to the instant gratification of daily fantasy. But they contend that the record of their top players shows that it's more than a game of chance.
We can show statistically that it's a game of skill. So we see our top players consistently winning, and we see, unfortunately, the players that aren't that skillful tend to get better over time, but don't necessarily always compete well with the high-skilled players.
FanDuel says they know of dozens of players who now play daily fantasy as a primary job.
Are you at all close to the point where you could give up your job as a postal office worker?
I could, but I don't want this as a job. I know there's people out there that do it full time. They're successful at it. I've seen people try it and fail at it. To me, I enjoy it as a hobby. If I turned it into my job, I think I would lose that passion for it.
ESPN's Darren Ravel reporting. Now, ESPN does accept advertising from daily fantasy sports sites provided they meet our guidelines. Let's welcome in our guests. Ryan Rodenberg, a Florida State assistant professor in sports management, who wrote a docket and filed an amicus brief in the U.S. Supreme Court case from June in which the court denied New Jersey Governor Chris Christie's lead appeal to allow sports gambling in New Jersey in professional and college sporting events in Atlantic City casinos and the state's racetracks. ESPN's senior writer and longtime fantasy expert Eric Karabell, and Glenn Colton, the author of the Fantasy Sports Trade Association's amicus brief, which introduced First Amendment implications into a case against Major League Baseball for the rights to use without license the names of and information about Major League Baseball players in connection with its fantasy baseball products. He is also the co-host of a Sirius XM show and a winner of 7 fantasy football and baseball league titles. All right, Eric, let's start with you. How would you characterize the growth of fantasy sports?
Well, it's hard to believe that I can do this for a job, but I can, and it's not because I can sing and dance. I mean, my goal here is to entertain and inform people that either listen or watch or whatever to what we do. Fantasy sports wasn't all that big 15 years ago, and now it's obviously huge. It's a billion-dollar industry. I just want people to remember we started this as a hobby. It's fun, and as long as you don't lose your passion for enjoying this game, then you're going to do okay in it. That's why I love to do what I do, is because I like to tell people what I think. I do pretty well. It is a game of skill to me, but you also need a little bit of luck on the side.
Now, with this growth of the daily fantasy industry, how much has the fun been taken out of this?
I don't think it's lost any fun for me. What I was doing anyway was kind of trying to help people that play daily, weekly, monthly, whatever it is. I mean, we introduced an article this year for daily fantasy baseball owners where we rank all the starting pitchers. We tell people who we think which hitters are going to do well. It hasn't ruined the fun for me. Certainly on Twitter and where people can comment, we've seen that people that are in daily fantasy leagues, the pressure's on. I mean, there's a lot of money involved here, so the pressure's a little bit different for them as it is for people like Glenn and I who play in a lot of weekly leagues. So we've seen that change, but it hasn't affected my passion for the game or for the job that I do.
Glenn, we heard in the piece about how Congress is watching what is going on. Obviously, they need to keep an eye on it as to whether or not this is considered gambling. Where is that line for you?
I think there's a huge difference between traditional gambling and fantasy sports, and Congress has agreed with that. Fantasy sports is a game of skill. People like Eric, people like others who play at a high level consistently win. They win because they're better at it. And Congress has made the judgment, and there's no reason to think that Congress is going to change the judgment that fantasy sports is a game of skill. It is not gambling. And frankly, so many Americans, 41 million people in the United States and North America play fantasy sports. It is in the very fabric of our society, and I don't think it's going to change.
Ryan, let's go back to that 2006 issue with Congress. I mean, what do you think they had in mind at that time as it relates now to this daily fantasy growth in the industry?
I looked at this when I went to the National Archives up in Washington, D.C., and inquired in terms of the legislative history that went into this 2006 statute. And it was somewhat revealing. I did not find anything specific that would indicate that Congress contemplated the fantasy of the daily variety when they passed this statute. Now, that's not to say that they went the other way and expressly prohibited by any means. The 2006 federal statute is very clear. If these fantasy contests meet 3 very specific requirements, they are expressly permissible under this statute. And that applies to both the traditional season-long fantasy as well as that of the daily variety.
Glenn, let me turn to you. How much can daily fantasy sports be a precursor to getting that daily sort of gambling fix?
Well, I think it sort of mixes 2 things. I think when you talk about daily fantasy, there's a tremendous amount of skill and knowledge involved that's to win in that, whereas gambling is a totally different animal. And I think, yes, there's a small population of the fantasy players that are in it for the money, but the most recent surveys done by the Fantasy Sports Trade Association shows that an overwhelming majority of people play for fun. And money is nice, but their primary motivation is to play for fun, and I think that's going to stay for a long time.
But Eric, we saw in that piece, I mean, yes, it's for fun, but at the same time, there is money on the line here. So with that being the case, especially with that younger generation that is getting into this on a daily instant gratification need. How dangerous is that?
It's not dangerous for me. I'm giving the same information to everybody. I mean, anything can be dangerous on the internet. You know, anybody who has children knows that. But, I mean, my favorite leagues that I've had the longest time, money either is not involved or not to a great extent. We play for pride. In experts leagues, we play to beat the guys on the other websites. So to me, that's the enjoyment of it. Could this get dangerous? I don't know. What I do is, though, I'm informing people what I think is going to happen either that day, that week, using trends, using the Doppler radar, whatever it is. I'm paying attention to the same things that we saw in that piece. I'm just not playing a lot of daily games to do it because I'm trying to enjoy myself the way fantasy was kind of built.
Ryan, what do you think are the dangers of daily fantasy as it relates to potentially leading to a bit of a gambling addiction, excuse me?
Well, that was one issue that arose in the course of the New Jersey sports wagering litigation that just recently concluded. So certainly lawyers for New Jersey brought up the fact that the sports leagues seem to embrace the fantasy angle, but are strictly against the more traditional point spread, totals, money line type of wagering. In terms of whether it's risky to youth or anyone for that matter, certainly high turnover of the daily leagues does distinguish it from more traditional season-long fantasy. There certainly have been no empirical studies that I'm aware of that find any significant results in that connection. Maybe those studies are forthcoming, but certainly one aspect of the daily leagues that's quite attractive to people is that they turn over every 24 hours, and hope springs eternal. So perhaps that you have one bad day, that the following day is much more productive and favorable to your results.
Glenn, you seem to be dismissing that there's any concern here with the daily fantasy industry. What are the concerns in fantasy right now?
Well, I mean, look, and as Eric said, anything on the internet is subject to potential abuse, right? So that's what we're talking about here. And the reality is the fantasy industry is very attuned to avoiding the games being used for improper purposes or inappropriate behavior. In fact, the Fantasy Sports Trade Association put out a code of conduct that sites need to follow in order to stay within the trade association. So there's a lot of people watching to make sure that the games actually follow the guidelines of the UIGEA, to make sure that they are properly described to consumers as games of skill, and to not conflate traditional gambling, which is different from fantasy, so it's clear to the users that they're playing a fantasy game of skill and that it's not gambling.
Eric, USA Today announced that it was going to get into the daily fantasy business. How much is this blossoming where other media conglomerates are going to try to get into this business?
Well, it's still a relatively young market, and
advertising and whatever else. And obviously, as we've seen, some of these companies are doing very well, and some of the players are doing well enough that they can quit their jobs. I think that's terrific. It still doesn't change what our goals are at ESPN Fantasy, I don't think, and maybe we'll get into the business as well, but I mean, I'm still having fun doing it, and as long as I'm having fun and I still have the passion for it, it doesn't really change anything for me. I've played in fantasy games before, and sometimes it can be enjoyable. Just don't lose that fun aspect. You know, I do well in fantasy games because I know what I'm doing, and it's a skill game. Certainly you need some degree of luck on the side as well, but I don't want to cross over. Once I cross over to that other side, I'm not going to enjoy it as much.
Ryan, what do you think makes someone cross over, to pick up on Eric's point there?
Oh, there's probably a few factors. I mean, and you asked specifically what are some dangers. Here's a very specific example. So most of the fantasy operators have a certain provision in their official rules, and it's a collusion provision. And this is an issue that came up certainly years ago when online poker was in its heyday. There's specific rules preventing players from colluding with each other for the purposes of somewhat manipulating these games. That's a real concern. I mean, if two or more players are colluding together, that puts at risk the integrity of the fantasy game that they're playing in. In terms of, I mean, if you can manage your bankroll and you have a pretty good sense of probability and mathematics, those type of things over the long term certainly are skill-based elements that would make for a favorable outcome for people. But the daily games are interesting. Much like poker, on any single day, someone with no acumen at all can do quite well. But over the long term, that any type of luck-based advantage they may have in a single day, that would dissipate fairly quickly.
Glenn, how much has the popularity of fantasy sports, especially with the NFL and Major League Baseball, enhanced each of those games?
Oh my goodness, fantasy sports has been an absolute manna from heaven for the Major League Baseball and the NFL. In fact, there are many out there that think that fantasy baseball is what allowed Major League Baseball to recover from the strike of 1994. You watch any NFL game and all of the statistics are scrolling underneath the picture of the game. Even the stadiums now are having separate fantasy sports cafes, and the Major League Baseball teams are having fan events for charity where you draft fantasy football teams with your favorite Major League Baseball player. It has absolutely been a boon to the economics of baseball and football.
Eric, obviously you make your living, covering this sport. There are others that do this as well at ESPN and other sites. So picking up on Glenn's point, how much has this changed the game?
It's made it better, frankly, because now people that play fantasy watch every single game. I think it adds to the ratings. It adds to people that go to the games. I mean, look on SportsCenter on the bottom line. All these stats are there. That's mainly because of fantasy sports. So I think this has grown every part of the game. The commissioners in the NFL and baseball, outgoing commissioner, they realize this as well. And I think NBA wants to grow this aspect of their business too. So fantasy sports are good for real sports. If you're a real good sports fan and you love the games, that's why you love fantasy as well. It's something that you can do with your friends, your family, coworkers, whatever it is. The sports are growing, and so is fantasy sports. I mean, honestly, they're sticking us on television. It's good for everybody.
Ryan, if you can, in 20 seconds here, what is your word of caution, though, about daily fantasy sports?
Those who participate in daily fantasy certainly should pick a reputable company. I mean, the risk to players outside of the state law considerations that we highlighted, if it's not a reputable company, certainly there is a small chance that your account could be frozen, and that happened exactly 3 years ago on Black Friday in the poker context. So that's probably the prevailing risk for fantasy players.
Ryan Rodenberg, Eric Karabell, Glenn Colton, thanks for joining us on Outside the Lines.
Pleasure.
Outside the Lines, brought to you by Diablo 3, Reaper of Souls, coming August 19th to console.
Pennzoil has reimagined a motor oil made from natural gas, proven to keep pistons cleaner than any leading synthetic, helping to protect against the loss of fuel economy. Designed for complete protection, born from natural gas. Pennzoil Platinum with Pure Plus technology. Motor oil reimagined.
Do it yourself and save with great deals on Pennzoil Platinum at Advance Auto Parts.
Oh, hello there. I'm Uma.
I'm Gary.
Let's make some free calls. Ooh. Oh.
Am I doing it right?
Oh, yeah.
Crystal clear nationwide calling for free. Uma, the smartphone for your home.
From the moment Clifford Paul created the Assist, his legacy lived on, both in his smile and in his style. From one generation to the next, State Farm agents never cease to assist you. That's getting to a better state.
How to enjoy 4 times HD TV quality with LG G3. Just watch. Introducing America's first Quad HD smartphone. 4 times HD resolution. LG G3. Simple is the new smart. Buy the LG G3, get the G Pad 7.0 LTE for only 99 cents. Only at AT&T.
Little Caesar's lunch combo is ready when you walk in, so it's perfect for busy people. Isn't that right, busy people?
Yes!
Get 4 slices of hot and ready deep dish plus a soda for just $5. Little Caesars, world's easiest way to pizza.
Pizza. There's a kid out there putting in work. He's the baddest player alive. He just doesn't know it. Because here, they tell you it's just a dream. You're playing the wrong kind of ball. They say you're too skinny, too nice. Too nice? Just go get a ball, find a hoop, and when you're ready, I'll be waiting.
Sitting in front of a camera all day is harder than it looks. So we bring in an expert to help us with our posture and delivery.
I want you to imagine a little string pulling your head up.
Where's the string?
You're holding a towel under your armpits. Eyes on the teleprompter. Don't look up to see the highlight. Look through the highlight.
You need a boatload of patience.
You know what? Forget everything I just said. Just be yourself. How's that feel?
Feels pretty good.
I like it too.